Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Tracy and Heather for having me. I didn't know anything about Rotary until I walked in the room, except that I've heard that you guys do really good work. So I'm very grateful to be here today. As Heather mentioned, I'm the owner of a yoga studio in town called the Yoga Lab. And I feel like immediately as I say the word yoga, there's probably a sense in the room of like, okay, we're just buckle up and come along for the ride. I imagine we'll end up in a place different than what you anticipate. You will not be doing yoga poses this morning, though I will make you take some deep breaths. So yeah, I grew up here in Bloomington Normal. I went to North Point Elementary, Kingsley Junior High, and then Normal Community High School for just 1 year, and then moved to Ohio. My parents worked for State Farm, obviously, and then moved back here to get a teaching job at Sugar Creek Elementary. So I taught first grade at Sugar Creek for 1 year, and then transitioned into work around social emotional learning. In the time of my grad program, I also got my yoga teacher certification, and Chris was asking me earlier, like, what got you into yoga? And it was a running injury. So I actually started yoga as a physical practice to find some space and some mobility for my physical body. But what I ended up realizing is I left class feeling much more regulated than when I walked in. And when I moved back to Bloomington, I started practicing at studios around town, and what I noticed was there was no community wrapped around yoga. So it was very transactional. You paid your money, you took your class, you left, and then you came back whenever you had the motivation or discipline to get back on your mat. And what I had experienced in other places around the country was that the reason I got on my mat was the accountability of the community and having space to connect with people on top of the regulation experience. So I decided to open a studio in town, which was not a part of my path or my plan when I finished grad school, but it has ended up being a phenomenal way to integrate all of the things that I do in the education space and the yoga space all into one thing. And I want to tell you a little bit about why we operate the studio the way that we do. I hope that you'll make your way over to the studio. I'm sure everyone in the room knows where the Windjammer is. So we're right in front of the Windjammer on South Prospect. So that's the main location, and right out of our back door you can go over and have a drink or whatever after class. But yeah, we're right in front of the Windjammer on South Prospect. So what I'd like to do before I get us started and start talking to you about brain science and stuff, I would like to invite you to put your feet on the floor and put your spine in a line, which just means to reach the top of your head towards the ceiling. And if you haven't stopped to take deep breaths in a while or ever, this is gonna feel uncomfortable, so it's okay. So you can close your eyes or you can set your eyes on the floor. And then take a moment to just notice how you are. Like how your body feels, the pace of your breath, any sort of story or drama you're in your head. And take a deep breath in through your nose. Open your mouth, exhale, let it go. Breathe in, fill all the way up. Exhale, empty. And one more deep breath in. And let it go. You can open your eyes if they're closed and come back into the room. Really quickly, I'd like for you to turn to the people at your table and share your 2-word check-in. So 2-word check-in is just 2 words about how you feel right in this moment. So for example, I feel nervous and grateful. And you're gonna have this tendency to explain why you're feeling what you're feeling, because our culture has taught us that you have to justify everything that you feel with a big long story. That's not true. So all you have to do is say your 2 words about how you feel. And it should take 30 seconds, 10 seconds for each person. So go ahead and do that really quickly.
I need a break.
Oh, I'm glad I'm not at the table. God bless you.
All right. Go ahead and finish up. You can tell your partners thank you for sharing.
Yeah, we're oversharing.
And then I would love if a few people could just shout out really quickly how you're doing so I can get a pulse or a temperature of the room.
Blake, you share it? Come on, Blake.
I didn't know this was for the room. I said I'm very interested and a little gassy.
All right, anyone have anything less personal to share?
Joyful, grateful, content.
Thank you.
That's too many.
That's okay.
And summarize the
Yeah. We'll have one more person.
someone at my table said numb. I'm not gonna say who it was.
Okay. Great. Thank you for sharing. Really good. So what I'd like to do is just kind of set this tone, set the stage with a little bit of brain science. So now that I've got you like here and engaged, I'm going to talk at you for a couple of minutes and then I'm going to contextualize it. So if it feels like a lot of information, it's because it is, and I'm saying it really fast because I have 17 minutes left to do this. And I'll recommend a book at the end of this if you want to know more, and or you can come to the Windjammer and then to the yoga lab and I'll tell you more about it. So this information on these next two slides I'm going to share with you is from the work of a man named Bruce Perry. So Dr. Perry recently wrote a book with Oprah called What Happened to You? That book is phenomenal. It's very accessible. I highly recommend it. Dr. Perry is a child psychiatrist. He's done work all over the world with tons of different people. He was the first person to receive the kids from the Branch Davidian Waco incident when those first group of kids were released from the compound. He was the person on staff who was working with those kiddos. So he's very well known in this world of neurobiology, brain science. And Dr. Perry worked with a longtime educator named Steve Grainer, who helped him conceptualize what this information meant for people in education spaces and laymen like us, maybe, unless there's any brain scientists in the room, to help us understand what this brain science means for our organizations and for the culture of leading people and supporting people. So I'm trained in Dr. Perry's work. That's what I'll be sharing with you right now. So just to give you some context. So what this chart or heuristic, an oversimplified graphic, shows us is that there are two ways that patterns of stress manifest in our brains and our bodies. And stress isn't actually inherently bad, though we often in our culture talk about stress like it's a bad thing. I'm so stressed, this is so stressful. Stress isn't actually bad for us unless it manifests in an unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged way. And I'll give you an example in just a moment. When stress is unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged, we become more sensitized or more vulnerable to stress over time. Oppositely, when stress happens in a predictable, moderate, and controllable way, we become more tolerant or more resilient to stress. So there's kind of a misnomer in culture around the impact of the pandemic, especially on kids. There was a lot of conversation about how kids are resilient. They'll be fine, right, through this pandemic. They're resilient. We know it's difficult for them to be operating in places and spaces like this, or even for us as adults, but we're resilient. Well, that actually isn't true. The pandemic was, in fact, unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged, and all of us who have experienced the pandemic are more sensitized and more vulnerable to stress than we were 3 years ago, which is an interesting thing to consider as we talk about cultural issues that are arising around conflict and the way people are dealing with each other in the world. It actually makes a lot of sense when we look at the brain science because of what people have been through. And I was teaching this information before the pandemic, so much easier to teach it now because we all have this experience. We all know what it feels like to have been at home, quarantined, to yell at someone about a pair of socks when you otherwise would not have done that because you were sensitized, you're reacting to stress in a different way. Stress, when it's predictable, moderate, and controllable, actually builds tolerance and resilience. So if we would have had like 10 years of a warning about this pandemic and been able to get our schools and our lives and our medical systems all organized around the fact that a pandemic was coming, make a plan, that kind of stress would have made us more resilient. Another example of this is exercise. So I've dabbled in running throughout my past few years, trained for marathons, whatever, have not run for a couple of years now. If I went out and tried to run a half marathon tomorrow, that would be an unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged stressor to my body. Oppositely, if I run 1 mile this week and 2 miles next week and 3 miles, over time, I work my way up, my body becomes more resilient or more tolerant to the running experience. Does that feel clear to everybody? So that information helps us understand then the way that our brain is set up, why it matters. So this is a very oversimplified view of your brain and my brain. So we call this the upside down triangle. So at the bottom of our brain, we have our brain stem. That's responsible for all of the things that we don't really think about, like our breath, our cortisol levels, heart rate, all of those things. The diencephalon is responsible for motor regulation. Limbic system is that relational part of your brain, the emotional part of your brain, and the cortex supports the reasoning part of your brain. So higher order thinking, problem solving, conflict resolution, all of those things. And what's important about this graphic here is that we like to assume that as I'm saying these words to you, talking about brain science, that my words, my reasoning part of my brain is talking directly to your reasoning part of your brain, but it's not. Because all of the information that comes into your brain from the outside world has to go through the bottom part of your brain. So if you're not regulated, you cannot relate and you cannot reason. And we function in our lives as if reasoning is the only place that we're living, but really there's all of this undertone of dysregulated people and disconnected people. And one thing that I observed in being here, being a new person, is that laughter and sense of humor is a large part of what you do here, which is regulating and relating so that you can solve problems in the community, right? You might not know that, but it clearly is inherent to the culture of at least this piece of the organization. And so there are things that we do that we inherently understand, but there are also ways that we can explicitly set up our lives and set up our organizational cultures to make sure that they're brain-based so that we can accomplish what ultimately we're trying to accomplish, which is having a bunch of people who are able to solve problems and make change in the world. So I knew this information before I opened the yoga lab, and it only made sense that the business was set up through the lens of regulate, relate, and reason so that I could accomplish the ultimate mission, which is to free people to do the work they love. So every time someone comes into the yoga lab, our goal is to have them freed up to do the work that they love. So the yoga isn't the end goal. It's a means to the end, that people can go back out and contribute wherever it is that they're at, right? State Farm, Rivian, schools, wherever they are. We want them to be more regulated and more connected so they can solve problems in their places and in their spaces. So in theory, that sounds really good. In practice, it's been very difficult to do, but I want to share with you kind of how we're working that at the studio. So we have yoga classes, over 30 classes a week. We teach a power yoga and a restorative yoga class. So we only have 2 styles of yoga that we teach. That's a very intentional choice because we're trying not to overwhelm people with options in a world that they don't know or understand. Over 90% of the people who are our members now had never practiced yoga before coming to the yoga lab. And I believe that one of the reasons that they were able to show up and it made it more accessible was because it's very simple. We keep it very simple. We can explain the power, we can explain the restorative, and that's all we do. So there have been studios in the past that have experienced that are like, we're for everyone, yoga for everyone. Like we do yoga, and we just don't do that. So we want everyone to experience yoga, and it may not be at the yoga lab, and that's totally fine, but we do what we do and we do it really well so that people can leave more regulated. So we have classes to regulate, we have coffee to relate. This is the most interesting part of the business, I feel like, because it doesn't make any sense. So when people walk into the studio, it's like there's a coffee shop, and on the sign outside it says yoga lab. It's like, okay, what is going on here? These people must be trying to do too much. But coffee inherently is a currency for people to connect and to stay. So remember at the beginning I said, like, we don't want a transactional experience. Well, if you ask people to stay, having a cup of coffee in their hand or an acai bowl to eat, it makes it way easier for them to stay and connect. And so what we've actually seen over the past year is that we have people who will come in for a class and leave right away. Then the next time they come in, they order their coffee, they take their class, they take their coffee to go. And then the next time it's like, okay, they order their coffee, they take their class, they have their coffee, and they stay. And maybe they don't talk to anyone, but they're present for the connection, the relational experience. And then moment by moment, day by day, they start to ease into community through coffee. So we have regulation through classes, relationship through coffee, and then reasoning through a community experience of learning. So the studio, when you come into it, it's physically set up to follow this sequence. So you walk in, there's yoga on the right, coffee on the left, and then in the back, there's a lab space. So it's a flexible workspace that holds about 25 to 28 people. And that space is a place where our members contribute to the community through higher order thinking, problem solving. So for example, in December, one of our members will be teaching on motivation theory. So our members will come, have a yoga class, drink their coffee, and then they'll go back to the lab space to have a conversation about motivation. What does that mean in our world and our life? So our members are inherently contributors to the community through that space. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures so that you can get a sense of it. So some of you might recognize this famous person in Bloomington Normal. This is Peggy. She owns Grove Street Bakery. Yeah, she's awesome. So she's a member. She's here regulating. Then we have our coffee shop here is relational, and then we have the lab space back here that supports reasoning. So I would love to pause for a second. We only have about 7 minutes left. And I'd like for you to reflect. I don't know if presenters ever make you talk to each other, so this might be odd and weird, but I'd love for you to talk to the people at your table about what opportunities you already see in your own places and spaces where you operate for people to feel regulated, related, and for them to do the work of reasoning. Just like I know that exists in this community. It might be subtle, but just point to that. Where are those opportunities in your places and spaces? And then if you have time, talk about what opportunities you see for growth in those areas where you live and you operate. Go ahead and do that for like 3 minutes.
We're the opposite of two strangers. It's not conducive. It's not conducive.
That's all I need to get these.
All right, go ahead and pause on that conversation. Tell your partner thank you for sharing. And then I'm wondering if we would have anyone who would be willing to share what you talked about at your table, just for the group. Anything really insightful that someone may have shared?
Is your gas okay?
That wasn't insightful, Jerry.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I'm a volunteer manager at Colorado, and I just had our annual fall seminars, which were different speakers that came in, but we also had a coffee portion of the socializing, and I'm always asking volunteers for new ideas and ways to enhance our patients' business experience. So, a lot of times that's what our volunteers are serving for too, is to be in their own.
Yeah, really good. Thank you for sharing. Yes.
I think what we might have come up with is that our environments have the relate and reason, but we might not personally, but we might not as a environment have our regulate.
Interesting. Let me know if you need some yoga. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing. So one thing that I do want to note and land before we're done here, I'll leave a couple minutes in case anyone has any questions, but one thing that's really important that I've seen as I'm thinking about this for our organization is what my life looks set, how it's set up to regulate and relate. Because I find that as a business owner, it's easy to push into problem solving and answering all of the questions and trying to get things done. And I don't always leave space for the regulation and the relationship. And that means that I can't show up and create that environment for my people either. So I would just challenge you too, as you leave, as a kind of takeaway, to ask yourself, what opportunities do you have in your own life, in your own environment, to regulate and relate, so that you can show up to whatever your organization is and whatever you're doing in the world to reason well. And if you need yoga, please come to the Yoga Lab. I would love to have you. I really, really appreciate being invited here. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Heather. And I would love to open up. Do people normally do questions?
Sure, yeah. Does
Okay.
anybody have any questions?
Okay. Yes.
Very quickly.
So, they were seated at circles to solve the problem with baby clothes. And I hope you'll talk before you go to see how you're going to do that.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
What are your hours and how big are your classes?
Good question. So our hours on the weekdays are 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. for the coffee shop. We have classes sprinkled in there. I do have a QR code that I can have you scan, or you can go on our website, theyogalab.org. And then our class size capacity is 30. Right now we're averaging about 15 people per class.